Have you ever felt lost, not knowing how to take the next step on your spiritual journey? Have you ever wondered why, in the midst of all your attempts to be faithful, suffering and difficulties never seem to give a respite? These doubts and anxieties are more common than we imagine. Even great figures in the Bible went through moments of uncertainty, questioning divine justice and the reason for suffering. Today, we're going to talk about Asaph, a biblical figure whose doubts and questions can resonate deeply with many of us. Asaph was not just a Levite, a singer, or a worship leader. He was a man who, even in the midst of the greatest difficulties, found in God an answer to his inner crises. In his life, he experienced a conflict between what he saw around him and what he believed to be truly fair. How did he deal with it? What did he do when the answers didn't come immediately? Asaph teaches us that, even in moments of greatest anguish, there is a path to clarity, and this path involves worship, deep reflection on God's sovereignty, and trust that He is in control of everything. This video is an invitation to reflect together on how, like Asaph, we can overcome our moments of spiritual crisis, finding strength and peace in God. If you have experienced or are experiencing moments of doubt, if your prayers seem unanswered and you wonder about the purpose of the difficulties you face, stay with us. Let's explore how Asaph's life can bring answers and renewal to your own faith. Asaph was a man of faith, a Levite chosen for a role of great importance in the Temple of Jerusalem. He not only served as a musician, but also as a worship leader, being responsible for leading the people of Israel in the worship of God. His position as a Levite meant that he was part of a tribe dedicated to divine service, with a direct link to the sacred. But Asaph was not just an ordinary musician. He was also a deeply spiritual man, committed to genuine and sincere worship of the Lord. Throughout his life, Asaph wrote several psalms, many of which express his internal struggle, his doubts, and most importantly, his trust in God. He was not someone who hid his emotions, but used music and poetry to dialogue with God, expressing both his anguish and his hope. This gives us a powerful insight into his humanity. Asaph, like many of us, faced deep questions about life and his own faith, but found in worship the key to renewing his trust in God. As a worship leader, Asaph had the responsibility of leading the people in worship, but this also meant that he spent a lot of time before God, pondering the most challenging spiritual questions. He knew that music and praise were not just outward expressions, but vehicles for a genuine encounter with the Creator. This devotion was manifested in a profound way, not only in the songs, but also in the meditation and reflection that accompanied the worship process. The most fascinating thing is that in addition to being a spiritual leader, Asaph was also a man who experienced pain and frustration like anyone else. He wasn't perfect, but his story is a testimony to how true faith can flourish even in the midst of difficulties. He teaches us that faith does not mean the absence of questions, but rather the willingness to seek answers from God, even when we do not fully understand the paths He chooses for us. The Psalms written by Asaph are not only songs of praise, but also profound expressions of spiritual struggle and honesty with God. Among the most notable psalms he wrote, the Psalm 73 stands out as a vivid portrait of doubt, frustration, and ultimately the discovery of divine truth. In Psalm 73, Asaph begins with a disturbing observation. Indeed, God is good to Israel, to the pure in heart. But as for me, my feet almost slipped. It took little for me to slip. Psalm 73 verses 1-2. He was perplexed by the prosperity of the wicked and the apparent injustice of God. For while the righteous suffered, the wicked seemed to prosper without difficulty. Asaph, like many of us in times of crisis, questions the meaning of life and whether fidelity is really worth it when suffering seems to be a constant. This raw honesty with God is a striking feature of the Psalms of Asaph. He doesn't hide his doubts or frustrations, but he presents them before God in a sincere way, and that's something we can all learn from. Instead of turning away from God in his doubt, he draws closer, seeking answers and direction. This attitude of vulnerability before God, without fear of expressing our deepest feelings, is a powerful lesson for us today. What is fascinating about Psalm 73 is that, as Asaph reflects on his anguish, he finds the answer the moment he enters God's temple. When I entered the sanctuary of God, then I understood their end. Psalm 73, verse 17. By focusing on God's presence and meditating on the Lord's greatness, Asaph had the revelation that, despite appearances, God has a sovereign plan and that divine justice will be carried out at the right time. This moment of spiritual clarity did not come instantly, but through a process of reflection, prayer, and search for the presence of God. By allowing himself this pause in his internal struggle, Asaph was able to understand, even if partially, the mystery of divine justice. He realized that although the wicked may seem to prosper for a time, in the end the true reward belongs to the righteous, who remain faithful to God. These Psalms of Asaph invite us to reflect on our own spiritual doubts. How do we deal with life's difficult questions? When faith is challenged, where do we look for answers? Asaph teaches us that, instead of running away from our questions, we must bring them before God with sincerity, knowing that He is capable of offering us the peace and understanding we seek so much. Asaph's spiritual struggle was not superficial or temporary. It reflected a deep inner crisis that many of us can relate to. In Psalm 73, Asaph describes how he almost lost his faith as he watched the prosperity of the wicked while he, a man faithful to God, faced suffering. This spiritual challenge was not just a matter of observing injustice in the world, but of dealing with real turmoil in the heart, questioning the goodness and justice of God. When Asaph looks at the wicked, he sees people who appear to live without problems, while the righteous, like him, are being afflicted. For I envied the arrogant when I saw the prosperity of the wicked. Psalm 73, verse 3. Here we see a very human crisis of faith. Asaph was not just observing external circumstances. He was struggling with a feeling of injustice and frustration, something many face when they appear to be doing everything right, but the results don't match their expectations. This question is not uncommon. How many times in our lives do we face challenges that make us question, why, if I am seeking God, am I facing difficulties? Why do the wicked prosper while I am struggling? These are legitimate questions that many Christians have in times of crisis. Asaph's dilemma is the dilemma of many of us when circumstances do not seem to reflect God's justice. Furthermore, Asaph was seeing the superficiality of the people around him. He did not understand why the wicked were so arrogant, as if they were above all judgment, living with indifference towards God. This generated even more frustration in him. He was seeing the world distorted by pain and frustration. It is important to note that, in his despair, Asaph found himself on the verge of losing his faith. So my heart was troubled, and my limbs were entangled. I was then senseless and ignorant. I was like a beast before you. Psalm 73, verses 21 to 22. He felt like he had lost control, like he was being consumed by doubt. He found himself at the mercy of circumstances, and no matter how hard he tried, he could not understand what God was doing. This fight is real. It is not something rare or exceptional, but rather a common part of the spiritual journey. We all have moments of perplexity, moments when we can't see beyond what's in front of us. These moments of crisis can leave us on the brink, making us question whether faith is worth it. However, it is in this space of questioning that a transformation can occur. Asaph teaches us that, even in the deepest doubt, faith does not need to disappear. She may be in a crisis, but she doesn't break. Even in despair, the search for answers is still valid. Asaph's sincerity in expressing his doubts before God is a powerful example for us. We often try to hide our feelings of doubt or frustration, but Asaph shows us that God is not bothered by our honesty. On the contrary, He welcomes us in our vulnerability. This crisis of faith that Asaph experienced is a reflection of the reality of many Christians throughout history and is still a relevant topic today. How do we deal with doubt? How do we face moments when faith seems to fail in the face of the reality of suffering? These questions do not have simple answers, but Asaph points us to the path of constant search for answers in God. His story teaches us that spiritual struggle can be a necessary step towards growth in faith. The transformation in Asaph's life begins to happen significantly when he decides to enter God's sanctuary. In the midst of his crisis of faith, he comes to the conclusion that the answers he was looking for would not only be found in human reason or in the observation of circumstances, but in the presence of God. The moment he enters the sanctuary, everything changes. When I entered the sanctuary of God, then I understood their end. Psalm 73, verse 17. This verse is a crucial turning point in the Asaph narrative. He finally realizes that the true perspective on the lives and destiny of the wicked can only be found through a supernatural vision, a vision that transcends limited human understanding. Asaph, by seeking the presence of God, is able to see beyond appearances, beyond the superficiality of the prosperity of the wicked and the pain of the righteous. The lesson here is powerful. The spiritual clarity Asaph experienced did not come from a change in external circumstances, but from an internal transformation brought about by the presence of God. He did not need to understand all the mysteries of life or explain the reasons for suffering. What he needed was to find rest in the sovereignty of God. This understanding comes when he sincerely turns to God, not only in prayer, but also through worship and meditation on the Scriptures. This teaches us a vital lesson for our own spiritual crises. We cannot find true peace and understanding in our own efforts or an incessant questioning of circumstances. The peace of God is not a peace that depends on what we see around us, but a peace that comes from trusting that God has everything under control, even when we can't see the whole picture. Asaph, upon entering the sanctuary, was able to change his perspective. He no longer focused on the fallacies of the prosperity of the wicked or the suffering of the righteous, but on the certainty that God, in his perfect justice, ruled over all things. This is the kind of spiritual clarity that can transform our lives. When we sincerely turn to God, He gives us a vision that goes beyond the immediacy of the situation and leads us to trust in His sovereign plan. Another important aspect of this divine response is that Asaph begins to perceive the end of the wicked. He understands that the temporary prosperity of the wicked is not something that will last. Surely you bring them into slippery places. You cause them to fall into destruction. Psalm 73, verse 18. Asaph now recognizes that despite outward appearances, those who reject God face an eternal disadvantage. Your vision becomes deeper, more spiritual. He sees beyond temporary prosperity and perceives each person's ultimate destiny based on the choices they make in relation to God. This understanding not only brings peace, but also deep gratitude and renewal of faith. Asaph begins to declare his renewed trust in God, saying, "But as for me, my happiness is in God, my rock, my refuge, my Lord." Psalm 73, verse 28. The clarity he found in the sanctuary was not just about the fate of the wicked, but about his own destiny, which was secure in God. He, who was previously on the verge of despair, now feels strengthened and confident in divine providence. This experience of Asaph reminds us of the importance of worship and the constant search for God's presence, especially in times of crisis. When everything around us seems to be falling apart, it is in the sanctuary of God, in prayer, in meditation on Scripture, in worship, and in reflecting on His sovereignty, that we find the peace that the world cannot offer. Asaph's transformation not only impacted his own spiritual life, but also his role as a worship leader and musician. As a Levite and one of the main musicians in the Jerusalem temple, Asaph played an essential role in the worship of the people of Israel. His spiritual experience and the clarity he found in God's presence profoundly shaped his approach to worship leadership, transforming the way he led worship and helped others connect with God. Asaph was not just a talented singer or musician. He was a spiritual leader, someone who used his music as a tool to lead people into the presence of God. His leadership was not limited to teaching songs or coordinating musical performances, but involved a mission to guide the hearts of the people in genuine worship, even in times of difficulty. After his experience of crisis and spiritual renewal, Asaph became an example of resilient faith and unshakable trust in God, qualities that he transmitted to the people through his music. Asaph's music was an extension of his personal journey with God. He did not sing just to express emotions, but to teach, to inspire, and to challenge others to reflect on the sovereignty of God in their own lives. When he wrote and sang the Psalms, especially the Psalms that spoke about divine justice and trust in God, he was not just composing an artistic work. He was leading the people in an act of worship that led to a greater understanding of God's justice. Asaph used music as a means of confronting the spiritual struggles he and the people of Israel faced. His role as a worship leader was not limited to a simple moment of entertainment, but involved a deep commitment to bringing the people closer to God, helping them to face their doubts, fears, and challenges with confidence in the Lord. His own experience of spiritual overcoming in dealing with doubt and anguish was a source of inspiration to those who listened to him. Asaph showed the people that worship was not just an escape from reality, but a way to face the realities of life with faith and hope in God. Asaph's music also had the power to reflect the collective experience of the people of Israel. Just as he went through a crisis of faith and found answers in the presence of God, he used his songs to help others reflect on their own spiritual journey. His music was not just a means of personal expression, but a way to create an atmosphere of collective worship where everyone could feel supported and empowered, regardless of their own struggles. A clear example of how Asaph's music helped the people reflect on deep spiritual questions can be seen in Psalms, such as Psalm 50 and Psalm 73. In Psalm 50, Asaph highlights the importance of true worship, which goes beyond external rituals and requires a sincere heart before God. He challenged the people to abandon hypocrisy and recognize that true worship comes from a heart that trusts in God's sovereignty. Furthermore, in Psalm 81, Asaph urges the people to remember God's great works in the past, using music as a way to cultivate gratitude and worship. Music becomes a tool of memory, helping people connect with the history and faithfulness of God. In doing so, Asaph not only led the people in worship, but also helped them understand that true faith involves remembering God's blessings and deeds, especially in times of trouble. Asaph's legacy goes beyond the songs he composed. His story of spiritual overcoming, combined with the fundamental role he played as a worship leader and prophet, leaves a profound impact not only on his generation, but on subsequent generations. His personal experience of crisis, doubt, and renewal of faith inspired not only Israel's contemporaries, but also those who, throughout history, became aware of his psalms and his life of devotion. Psalm 73, which so vividly describes his inner struggle, his doubt, and ultimately his discovery of peace as he seeks the presence of God, serves as a model for how to deal with spiritual adversity. The way Asaph not only expresses his anguish, but also shares the experience of divine response, provides a path for those facing similar questions in their own lives. Asaph, on his journey, teaches us that there is no shame in questioning, in doubting, but that the true answer lies in turning to God and trusting in his sovereignty. Through his music, Asaph also left a legacy of worship that endures. His work is not just a collection of songs, but a profound theology that addresses issues of divine justice, the prosperity of the wicked, God's faithfulness, and the need for trust, even in times of crisis. His psalms, especially those dealing with divine justice and inner struggle, continue to be a source of comfort and instruction for Christians throughout the world. He shows us that true worship goes beyond ritual. It is an authentic expression of faith that reflects our journey with God, with all its difficulties and victories. Furthermore, Asaph's leadership is a clear example of how music can be a powerful instrument in spiritually building a community. In a time when music and worship were essential to worship, Asaph used his position as a worship leader to guide the people on a profound spiritual journey. His music was not just a matter of artistic quality, but of spiritual intent, leading people to reflect on the greatness of God and to surrender to his sovereignty. In his role as worship leader, Asaph also established a tradition that influenced subsequent generations. He was the forerunner of a line of musicians and worshipers who understood that true worship is not based merely on superficial emotions, but on a deep awareness of God's presence and the need to approach Him with humility and reverence. Asaph's impact can be seen in subsequent psalms, such as those of David and other leaders, who continued to build on the principles he established. But Asaph's legacy is not limited to his music or temple leadership. He also left an example of resilient faith, a model of how a man of God can, even in moments of doubt and difficulty, remain firm in the confidence that God is just and sovereign. His spiritual journey is not just a story of struggle, but of victory, because he found the path to peace. And that peace was not in understanding everything, but in trusting that God was in control of all things. Today, Asaph's legacy continues to live on in the lives of all those who approach God in search of answers to their own spiritual crises. His honesty, his vulnerability before God, and his ability to transform his doubts into authentic worship make him an eternal example of faith. It teaches us that even in our darkest moments, God is present, ready to give us the clarity, peace, and renewal we so desperately need. The life and Psalms of Asaph offer valuable spiritual lessons for dealing with adversity. His journey of doubt, reflection, and transformation teaches us that, in times of crisis, the true answer lies not in external circumstances, but in our ability to turn to God with sincerity and confidence. Asaph teaches us the importance of honesty before God. In Psalm 73, he openly expresses his doubts and frustrations, showing that we can approach God with vulnerability, without fear of rejection. God is willing to listen to our anxieties and give us the clarity we need. Furthermore, worship for Asaph is essential not only in moments of joy, but also to overcome crises. It helps us redefine our perspective and strengthen our faith. As we seek God's presence in praise, we find rest and renewal. Another powerful teaching from Asaph is to seek wisdom and clarity from God. His transformation took place upon entering the sanctuary, where he gained divine perspective. Likewise, in times of confusion, we must seek God's presence to gain the necessary insight, even without understanding all the circumstances. Asaph also challenges us to lead and influence others through worship. His temple music was not just to minister, but to guide the people to more authentic worship. On our spiritual journey, we must be honest with God, use worship as a tool for overcoming, trust in divine sovereignty, and seek clarity in His presence. In this way, we transform crises into moments of growth and live a more authentic and faith-filled life. The story of Asaph, although it took place millennia ago, remains extremely relevant to the modern church. Their spiritual struggles, doubts, and the search for genuine faith are issues that many Christians still face today. In times of crisis and uncertainty, Asaph's experience of moving from doubt to trust in God serves as a model of resilient faith. He teaches us that even without all the answers, we can trust that God is in control, and true faith does not depend on understanding every detail of life, but on surrendering to the Lord with confidence. The modern church, like Asaph, faces challenges such as the search for answers to life's big questions and the pressure to live perfectly. However, the story of Asaph reminds us that God does not reject our vulnerability, and that true worship comes from a sincere heart. Music and worship continue to be powerful tools of spiritual transformation, both for the people of Israel and for the church today, guiding believers closer to God. As we reflect on the life and legacy of Asaph, we are challenged to apply these teachings to our own spiritual journey. If you are in a moment of doubt or difficulty, remember that, like Asaph, you can find clarity and peace in the presence of God. If this video touched your heart, like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Leave your comments about Asaph's life and how he has strengthened his faith in times of crisis. Let us together strengthen our spiritual journey and inspire others to trust in God, regardless of the circumstances.